They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but in my case, it was served with a lawsuit, and a hefty one at that. When Karen from the HOA decided to take matters into her own hands and ruin my plants with bleach, she didn't just kill my garden. She set in motion a series of events that would ultimately leave her with a $100K lawsuit to answer for. Little did she know, I wasn't going to let her reckless actions slide. I was going to take back what was mine and make her pay for every single damaged leaf. For as long as I could remember, my garden had been my sanctuary, my pride, and my escape from the noise of the world. Every inch of it reflected the hours of hard work I had poured into it, the late mornings spent under the sun, the quiet evenings tending to the plants, the careful and methodical way I planted each seed, nurtured each sprout, and watched them grow. It wasn't just a collection of flowers and vegetables. It was a living, breathing testament to my dedication and love for nature. Over the years, it had transformed into something beautiful, something uniquely mine. There was something profoundly calming about the rhythm of gardening. Each day I would wake up with the soft sunlight peeking through the windows, my first thought always being to step into the garden and see how everything had grown overnight. The smell of fresh earth, the vibrant colors of the blooms, the gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind, all of it filled me with a sense of purpose and peace. The garden was my therapy, a place where I could forget the outside world and immerse myself in the simple yet satisfying act of nurturing life. There was no judgment here, no stress, just the quiet hum of nature. I grew everything from towering sunflowers to delicate lavender, from ripening tomatoes to bright marigolds. Each plant had its own story, its own history of when it was planted, how it had been cared for, and the joy it brought me when it finally blossomed. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked away in a community that prided itself on maintaining a certain order and aesthetic. The homes were well kept, the lawns neat, and the sidewalks free of clutter. At first, it was exactly what I had been looking for, a peaceful, suburban life where everything was calm, safe, and predictable. The Homeowners Association, HOA, existed to maintain that order, to ensure that no one strayed too far from the prescribed norms that kept the neighborhood looking pristine. For the most part, the HOA's duties were simple, ensuring the lawns were mowed, the streets were cleaned, and no one painted their house an obnoxious color. It was the kind of oversight that I had no issue with. I respected the idea of community and keeping things tidy. As a rule follower myself, I had no objections to the HOA's general guidelines. I knew that being part of such a community meant adhering to some restrictions, and I accepted that. I never imagined that the HOA would become the source of conflict in my life. However, there was one individual in the HOA who seemed to take these rules more seriously than anyone else. A woman named Karen. She had an affinity for enforcing every little rule, no matter how trivial it seemed. Where most people saw the HOA's guidelines as gentle nudges to maintain harmony, Karen saw them as tools for control. She thrived on the power these regulations gave her, using them as weapons to assert her dominance over those she deemed non-compliant. The more I encountered her, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just following the rules. She was using them to impose her will on others. And for reasons that were unclear at first, I became her target. It started with small things. Things I never thought would escalate into something more. She first approached me about my garden when she noticed that my hedges were slightly taller than what was deemed acceptable by the HOA's guidelines. She said they were obstructing the view of my neighbors. A simple letter arrived in my mailbox, politely asking me to trim them down to a certain height. At first, I thought it was a harmless request. After all, it wasn't a big deal to trim a few branches, and I complied without much thought. I didn't argue. It seemed like a minor issue, and I had no desire to cause any tension with my neighbors or the HOA. But soon Karen found other things to criticize. Next, it was the size of my flower beds. She claimed that the edges of my garden were starting to spill over into the sidewalk, which, according to her, could be a safety hazard. Again, I complied, carefully re-edging my flower beds to ensure they were within the required limits. At this point, I began to wonder if Karen had too much time on her hands, but I still didn't think much of it. I saw it as part of living in a neighborhood governed by an HOA. It was just part of the routine, something I had to do to keep the peace. Then came the day I received a letter from her regarding the color of my front door. She claimed that the shade of green I had chosen for the door didn't match the HOA's aesthetic guidelines and was out of harmony with the neighborhood's look. It was a vibrant, cheerful shade of green. Nothing outrageous, nothing out of place. But Karen felt the need to mention it. That was when I started to feel the first pangs of frustration. I had been following the rules, maintaining my property, and doing everything that was asked of me. Why was Karen so obsessed with my choices? Why was she fixated on my garden and my home? It was around this time that I began to suspect that Karen wasn't just interested in following the rules. She was interested in control. She wasn't satisfied with just enforcing the rules. She enjoyed wielding the power that came with them, using her position to force people to conform to her idea of what the neighborhood should look like. And somewhere along the way, my garden had become a symbol of everything she despised. It wasn't just about a few hedges or flower beds anymore. It was about me, about my unwillingness to conform to her standards. I wasn't going to let it go. The more she criticized my garden, the more I realized how much it meant to me. My garden was my sanctuary. It wasn't just about the plants. It was about my identity. It was about creating something beautiful from the earth, something that reflected my personal touch. I had always prided myself on the fact that my garden was a place of life and color, a place where I could escape from the stress of everyday life. But Karen had made it clear that my pride in my garden was a problem. She saw it as a threat, something that didn't fit into her rigid vision of what was acceptable. And at that moment, I realized that Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was someone who wanted to impose her will on others, to make them conform to her standards, whether they wanted to or not. It wasn't just my garden she was targeting. It was anyone who dared to be different. And so I began to brace myself. This wasn't just going to be a simple back and forth about flowers and hedges. I was about to find out just how far Karen would go to enforce her vision of order. What I didn't know then was that this would escalate into something far worse than I could have ever imagined. A battle for my garden, my home, and my right to live the way I chose, without interference. As Karen's demands grew more ridiculous, so did my determination to fight for what was mine. But little did I know that the conflict that had started over a few hedges and flower beds would soon turn into a full-blown war. A war that would involve far more than just flowers and fences. It would be about standing up to the people who believed they had the right to control every aspect of your life. It was early morning when I first noticed something wasn't right. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the neighborhood, and I decided to step outside to check on my beloved garden. The air was cool and still, and for a moment everything seemed calm, untouched by the chaos that was about to unfold. I had always cherished these quiet moments with my plants, where the world felt peaceful and my garden was my little sanctuary. But that morning, as I walked toward the gate that separated my house from my garden, a sharp, nauseating smell hit me like a wave. It was pungent and unmistakable. Bleach. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I rushed through the gate, hoping that I was imagining it, that the scent was coming from somewhere else, somewhere distant. But as soon as I stepped into the garden, I knew with sickening certainty that I was not mistaken. My entire garden, everything I had worked so hard to cultivate, was destroyed. It wasn't just a few plants that had been damaged. No, this was something far worse. Every single plant, from the fragile flowers to the sturdy vegetables, was wilted and turning brown. The bright red roses that had stood so tall, proud of their beauty, now hung limply from their stems. The vibrant green leaves of my spinach and lettuce were shriveled, their edges curled and burnt. Even my beloved sunflowers, the ones that had sprouted in a perfect row, their tall stems reaching toward the sky, were no longer standing. They had collapsed under the weight of the chemical assault, their once strong stalks now bent and lifeless. The shock of the sight left me breathless. I could feel my chest tightening as my heart sank deeper with every step I took into the ruined garden. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. How could this be? Who would do such a thing? I knelt down beside one of the damaged plants, touching the soil, which felt oddly slick and damp. That's when I saw it, the unmistakable marks of bleach. In the far corner of the garden, half hidden behind a bush, were several empty bottles of bleach. Their caps had been twisted off and discarded carelessly on the ground, the liquid residue still visible inside. It was as if someone had intentionally poured the bleach all over my plants, bathing them in a corrosive solution that had destroyed everything in its path. My stomach churned at the thought of the damage that had been inflicted. This wasn't some accident, some mistake. It was deliberate. This was an act of malice, pure and simple. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police to report the destruction of my property. But as I stood there, looking at the devastation before me, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Who could I blame for this? I had no proof, no clear evidence linking anyone to the crime. There were no security cameras, no eyewitnesses. The bottles of bleach could have been discarded by anyone. I could suspect someone, but suspicion alone wasn't enough to build a case. I was left with a bitter, helpless feeling, knowing that whoever had done this had succeeded in taking away something irreplaceable, something that I couldn't get back. The only person I could think of, the only person who had shown consistent disdain for my garden, was Karen. Karen, the HOA board member, the one who had never been happy with the way I maintained my property. It had always been something small, complaints about the height of my bushes or the color of my flowers. But I knew she hated the garden. She hated how I maintained it so passionately, how it had become a little oasis, a stark contrast to the neatly trimmed lawns that dotted the rest of the neighborhood. She had made it clear in the past, through subtle comments and not-so-subtle looks, that she believed my garden was an eyesore, a disruption to the perfect image the HOA tried to maintain. I had no proof, no physical evidence linking her directly to the crime, but I knew it was her. It had to be. Who else would go to such extreme lengths to destroy my garden? Who else would be so petty, so cruel, as to deliberately ruin something that meant so much to me? Karen had always been vocal about her dislike for anything that didn't fit into her narrow vision of the neighborhood, and now, it seemed, she had crossed a line that was unforgivable. The more I thought about it, the more the idea took root in my mind. Karen was the only person who had shown such open disdain for my garden. She had always been the type to use her position in the HOA as a way to control others, to impose her standards on people like me who dared to live outside of her idea of what was acceptable. I had dealt with her minor complaints in the past, brushing them off as just another of her overbearing tendencies. But now, with the garden destroyed and the smell of bleach still lingering in the air, I couldn't ignore the fact that this was personal. This wasn't just about some trivial violation of HOA rules. This was an act of sabotage, one that had been carried out with malicious intent. I walked around the garden, inspecting every corner, my mind racing with a mix of anger, disbelief, and confusion. How could someone do this? How could they take something so beautiful, so carefully nurtured, and destroy it in an instant? My hands trembled as I touched the wilted petals of the roses, The once beautiful blooms now nothing more than burned remnants. It wasn't just the loss of the plants that hurt, it was the violation of trust, the sense that someone had deliberately come into my space, my sanctuary, and taken everything from me. It felt like an invasion, like the one thing that had always been mine was no longer safe. The bleach had done its damage, the plants were beyond saving. I could try to replant, but it would take months, maybe even years to get the garden back to the way it was. And even then, it wouldn't be the same. The sense of loss weighed heavily on me, but beneath it something else stirred, something darker, something more dangerous. This wasn't just about the plants anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for my property, for the things I loved. Karen had crossed a line, and now I would make sure she understood the consequences of her actions. I had no proof yet, but I would get it. I would find a way to prove that Karen had been responsible for this. And when I did, I would make sure she paid for what she had done. I would take action, not just for the garden, but for everyone who had ever been the victim of her petty power struggles, her obsession with control. She had taken something from me, and I would make sure she learned that you can't just destroy someone's life and get away with it. After the shock of finding my garden destroyed by bleach, after the initial heartbreak and confusion, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't let Karen's cruelty slide. This wasn't just about the plants. It wasn't just about a garden. It was about standing up for what was mine, for what I had worked so hard to create. More than that, it was about sending a message. No one, not even someone with the authority of an HOA board member, had the right to destroy my property out of spite. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The decision to take legal action was not an easy one. In the aftermath of the destruction, I had spent a lot of time trying to process everything, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, frustration, sadness, they all mixed into a sense of helplessness. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure where to start. So I consulted a lawyer. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted justice. I wanted accountability. The lawyer I spoke with, a woman named Laura, was calm and empathetic. She listened intently as I told her everything that had happened, from Karen's initial complaints about my garden to the bleach attack that had destroyed it. I explained how I had no proof, just a deep gut feeling that Karen was responsible. But Laura didn't dismiss me. She didn't brush off my emotions or my suspicion. Instead, she said something that resonated with me. She said, "Even if we can't prove it immediately, there are steps we can take. We'll gather evidence, we'll find the facts, and we'll make sure Karen is held accountable for what she's done." That was all I needed to hear. I wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. I wasn't going to let her continue to wield her power over people, using the HOA to manipulate and control others. This time, she had gone too far. I would fight for my garden, for my property, and for my right to live peacefully without fear of retaliation from someone with a personal vendetta. I filed a lawsuit against Karen and the HOA, demanding compensation for the damage she had caused. The case would be complicated, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But I was determined. I wasn't just fighting for the garden, it was about standing up for what was right, for holding someone accountable when they thought they could get away with something as cruel as this. At first, Karen denied any involvement. She acted like the perfect picture of innocence, claiming that the bleach had come from an accident, that it wasn't intentional, that it had been someone else's fault. She said it was just a harmless mistake, nothing more than a spill, something that could happen to anyone. But I knew better. I knew that she had done this intentionally, that she had destroyed my garden out of spite. I knew she wanted to punish me for not conforming to her rigid vision of how things should be in the neighborhood. She was angry because my garden didn't fit her idea of what was acceptable, and she had taken it upon herself to eliminate what she saw as a problem. With Laura's help, I began to gather evidence. I started with photographs. My heart broke as I stood in front of the garden, camera in hand, capturing the damage that Karen had caused. The wilted roses, the shriveled lettuce, the lifeless sunflowers, all destroyed by a chemical that should never have come near them. Each photo was a painful reminder of what had been taken from me, but it was also the first step in proving my case. I spoke to my neighbors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual, anyone acting suspiciously near my property around the time. The bleach was poured. Some of them were hesitant at first, unsure of getting involved in something that seemed so petty. But a few had noticed things they hadn't thought much of at the time. One neighbor, a woman named Susan, told me that she had seen Karen in the area a few days before the garden was destroyed. Susan had noticed Karen walking around with a large bag of something and had found it odd that she was so close to my property. At the time, Susan hadn't thought to mention it, but now it seemed like an important clue. Another neighbor, John, mentioned that he had seen Karen's car parked near my fence during the night. He hadn't thought anything of it then, but in hindsight it seemed suspicious. These were small observations, but they were starting to add up. I also discovered something else, something that made the case even more personal. As I dug deeper into Karen's history with the HOA, I uncovered a pattern of behavior that was both alarming and infuriating. Karen had a history of using her position to harass and intimidate residents. She had made countless complaints about neighbors' properties, enforcing rules with a zeal that bordered on obsessive. There were records of her making false reports, demanding that people cut down trees or remove plants because they didn't fit into her strict vision of what the neighborhood should look like. It wasn't just about the garden. It was about control. Karen had made it clear that she felt entitled to decide what others could or could not do with their property. And now, with my garden, she had taken things too far. As the weeks passed, the case began to take shape. Karen's lawyers tried to discredit me, claiming that I was exaggerating the damage, that the bleach wasn't as harmful as I made it seem, and that there was no proof linking Karen directly to the crime. They tried to argue that I was simply looking for an excuse to sue. But with every new piece of evidence, every new witness who came forward, the truth became harder for them to deny. I wasn't just fighting for my garden. I was fighting for justice. And as the case progressed, I began to realize something even more profound. This wasn't just about me. This was about standing up to someone who had used her power to harm others, someone who had taken it upon herself to destroy what didn't fit into her narrow view of the world. The more evidence I presented, the more the case tilted in my favor. Photos of the destroyed garden, witness statements from neighbors who had seen Karen acting suspiciously, the bleach bottles that had been left behind, which, when tested, confirmed that they were linked to the brand of bleach commonly used by Karen herself. There was no doubt in my mind anymore. Karen had done this, and she had done it with the intention of ruining my property because she couldn't stand that my garden didn't conform to her standards. The pressure began to mount on Karen. Her defenses grew weaker, her denials less convincing. She knew she had done something wrong, and she knew that the evidence was stacked against her. It wasn't long before she began to panic. She tried to negotiate, offering a settlement to avoid further legal action. But I wasn't interested in settling. I wasn't interested in letting her off the hook just because she had the money to buy her way out. This was bigger than money. This was about standing up to someone who thought they could control other people's lives. As the case approached its final stages, I could feel the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The long months of gathering evidence, the sleepless nights spent wondering if I was doing the right thing, the constant pressure from Karen's lawyers. It all came down to this. And when the final hearing took place, I was ready. The judge's ruling came quickly, and when I heard those words, "We find in favor of the plaintiff," I felt a surge of relief. The $100,000 in damages wasn't just about the money, it was about making sure Karen understood that her actions had consequences. It was about showing her that no one, not even a board member of the HOA, had the right to destroy another person's life out of spite. In the end, I had won. Not just for my garden, but for every person who had ever felt the weight of a system that was meant to protect, but instead abused its power. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for justice, for standing up to bullies, and for showing that no one, no matter how much power they thought they had, could get away with destroying another person's life. And for the first time in months, I felt free. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. My palms were clammy, my heart pounding in my chest as I sat quietly beside Laura, my lawyer. The space around me felt both surreal and suffocating. After months of preparation, of gathering evidence, of living through the emotional and physical toll of the legal battle, I was finally here, at the moment where it would all come to a head. The judge was sitting at the front, flipping through his papers, the faint sound of the rustling pages the only noise filling the room. Karen, sitting across from me, appeared composed, her face set in a mask of defiance, but I could sense her unease. Despite her cold exterior, I knew the reality of the situation had begun to sink in. She had underestimated me, and now the day of reckoning had arrived. She sat there with her lawyer, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring at me as if she still believed she could talk her way out of this. Her sense of entitlement, her refusal to admit her wrongdoing, still hung heavily in the air. But I was resolute. I had fought too hard to let her manipulate the situation anymore. I had stood my ground through every argument, every tactic her lawyers had thrown at me, and I wasn't about to back down now. My neighbors, those who had witnessed the damage, who had stood by me from the very beginning, sat in the back of the room, a small but supportive presence. They had seen the destruction firsthand, had seen how my garden, my pride and joy, had been callously ruined. They knew the truth, and they were here to back me up. As the judge flipped the final pages of his notes, the silence grew more oppressive. I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on the room, the eyes of the public, the eyes of my neighbors, all waiting for the judgment. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge looked up from his papers and spoke. The court has considered the evidence, and after careful deliberation, I hereby rule in favor of the plaintiff, awarding the sum of $100,000 in damages for the destruction of property, as well as the emotional distress caused by the defendant's actions. I didn't hear much after that. My heart had stopped racing, but time seemed to slow. My ears buzzed with the sound of the judge's voice, but I could barely register the rest of his words. The room seemed to disappear, my entire focus on what had just been said. I had won. The weight of the verdict hit me like a tidal wave. All the sleepless nights, the painstaking effort of building the case, the countless hours spent collecting evidence and presenting it, all of it had culminated. In this moment, the court had recognized my right to protect my property, to stand up against someone who had abused her position to destroy something that was sacred to me. And it wasn't just about the money, not even close. It was about justice. Karen had tried to ruin my life, to destroy the one thing that gave me solace and peace. She had taken something from me that could never be replaced. But now, in this moment, the balance had shifted. She was the one who would have to answer for her reckless actions. As the courtroom began to clear, I sat there for a moment, stunned by the magnitude of the decision. I had been through so much to get to this point, so much self-doubt, so much fear. I had wondered if I was doing the right thing, if this would be worth it in the end. But now I knew without a doubt that it had been. It had all been worth it. My neighbors, who had attended the trial to show their support, gathered around me as we exited the courtroom. I could see the pride and relief on their faces. They had witnessed what Karen had done to my garden, had watched her turn my sanctuary into a battlefield, And now they saw the justice that had been served. Some of them patted me on the back. Others simply nodded in quiet approval. I knew that they were proud of me, and I was proud of myself, too. I had stood up to Karen, to the HOA, to the system that had allowed people like her to hold power over others. I had fought back, not with violence or anger, but with the law, with facts, and with the strength of conviction. And in the end, that had been enough. Karen, on the other hand, didn't share in my sense of victory. She stormed out of the courtroom with her lawyer, her face flushed with anger. There was no apology, no remorse, only a bitter look that said everything. She couldn't accept that she had been beaten. She couldn't accept that someone had finally stood up to her and won. But that was her problem. She was the one who had crossed a line, and now she had to pay the price. The $100,000 in damages was not just compensation for the plants she had destroyed. It was compensation for the emotional toll her actions had taken on me. My garden had been more than a collection of flowers and vegetables. It had been my retreat, my sanctuary, my escape. And she had taken that from me, with no regard for the effort, the time, and the love I had poured into it. But now, I was being recognized for the emotional distress she had caused. The victory wasn't just mine. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced or made to feel small by people like Karen, people who used their power for selfish gain. As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, yes, but also something deeper: pride. I had stood up for myself, for my property, for my right to live peacefully without fear of retribution from anyone who felt entitled to control my life. And in the process, I had made a statement, not just to Karen, but to the entire community. Sometimes the best way to fight back against injustice is not with anger or violence, but with determination, with patience, and with the belief that justice will prevail. It wasn't just the garden that had been restored that day. It was my sense of self. I had faced down someone who had tried to destroy everything I cared about, and I had come out on top. I had won. As the days passed, the news of my victory spread throughout the neighborhood. People who had been hesitant to speak up against Karen's overbearing ways now felt emboldened. They saw what could happen when someone stood up against the system, when someone refused to let their rights be trampled on. I wasn't the only one who had been affected by Karen's cruelty. Others had been quietly living in fear of her, afraid that they might be next. But now they knew that they had a voice, that they could stand up to. I had given them hope. The HOA, meanwhile, was forced to acknowledge the damage done under their watch. They could no longer protect Karen, no longer shield her from the consequences of her actions. I wasn't the only one who had won that day, the entire community had. But for me, the victory wasn't just about the money. It wasn't about the lawsuit or the legal battle. It was about the principles. It was about proving that no one, not even someone with power, could destroy what you loved without facing the consequences. It was about showing that even in the face of injustice, there is always a way to fight back. And sometimes, just sometimes, that fight can lead to something greater than you ever imagined. Karen had thought she could break me, but she was wrong. She had only made me stronger. And as I looked out over the remains of my garden, I knew that the next chapter of my life would be even more rewarding. My victory was just the beginning. If you've ever been pushed to the edge by an unfair system, it's time to take a stand. Subscribe to the HOA stories and see how justice can be served no matter the odds.